She thought the worst part of her night was the past due notice slipped under her door. Then she saw the heavy smear of crimson ruining her cheap linoleum. A man was bleeding out in her kitchen, a bullet in his gut, and a customized Glock still gripped loosely in his hand. She saved his life because she was a nurse, and the alternative was a corpse in her apartment. But when his eyes finally fluttered open, his first question didn't just chill her blood, it sealed her fate. The rain in the city didn't wash things clean, it just made the grime slicker. Maeve Gallagher dragged her boots up the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, the fluorescent lights in the stairwell buzzing like dying wasps. She had just finished a 16-hour shift at St. Jude's emergency room. Her scrubs smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of other people's bad luck. Her bones ached with a deep, hollow exhaustion that sleep never entirely fixed. She turned the corner of her landing and stopped. Her door was cracked open. The brass deadbolt, the one she had installed herself after a string of break-ins last October, hung loose, the wood of the doorframe splintered inward. Maeve didn't gasp. Growing up in this neighborhood burned the panic out of you early, replacing it with a cold, heavy stone in your stomach. She reached into her canvas tote bag, her fingers wrapping around the handle of her heavy metal flashlight. She pushed the door open with the toe of her boot. It swung silently on its hinges. The apartment was dark, save for the sickly orange glow of the street lamp bleeding through the window blinds. At first, she thought she'd been robbed, but robbers didn't leave a trail of thick, dark liquid leading from the entryway into the narrow kitchenette. Maeve switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom and settled on the floor. Blood. A lot of it. She followed the trail. The flashlight illuminated a pair of expensive leather shoes, ruined by mud and red splatter, then dark, tailored slacks, and finally a man slumped against the base of her refrigerator. He was unconscious. His head hung forward, chin resting on a chest that rose and fell in shallow, jagged gasps. One hand was pressed tight against his lower abdomen, slick and dark. The other rested on the floor, fingers curled loosely around a matte black handgun. He wasn't a junkie looking for cash. The suit alone cost more than she made in a year. The watch on his wrist caught the flashlight's beam. Heavy, brushed steel, impossibly clean against the gore. Maeve stood frozen. The smart thing to do was walk back out, go down to the bodega on the corner, and use the payphone to call the cops. But she knew how that story ended. The police would tear her apartment apart, interrogate her for 12 hours, and leak her name to whatever enemies had put a bullet in this man. In this city, catching a stray bullet was a tragedy. Snitching was a death sentence. A low, wet groan tore from the man's throat. His head rolled to the side. Maeve's training kicked in, drowning out the fear. He was bleeding out. If she left to make he'd be dead before the patrol cars even jumped the curb. She dropped her bag, kicked the gun away from his hand, and fell to her knees beside him. "Hey," she said, her voice sharp, slapping his cheek lightly. "Hey, can you hear me?" No answer. His skin was clammy, pale as ash. She ripped his ruined suit jacket open. The white dress shirt underneath was soaked through. Maeve grabbed a pair of trauma shears from her scrub pocket, a habit from the ER, and cut the shirt away. The entry wound was an ugly, ragged hole 2 inches above his hip bone. It was still pumping slow, dark rhythm. She pressed her bare hands hard against the wound, throwing her weight into it. He flinched violently in his unconscious state, his jaw clenching, but his eyes didn't open. Okay, you're not dying on my floor today," she muttered. Maeve couldn't move him. He was at least 200 pounds of dead weight. She reached blindly behind her, yanking a clean dish towel off the oven handle and shoved it against his side, applying maximum pressure. She reached into her tote bag with her free hand, pulling out her emergency kit. It was stocked with stolen supplies from the hospital: gauze, surgical tape, a stapler, iodine, and lidocaine. Survival tools for a woman living alone in the worst zip code on the East Coast. She held the pressure for 10 agonizing minutes. The blood flow slowed to a sluggish seep. She wiped the excess away, squinting in the dim light. There was no exit wound. The bullet was still in there. If it had hit the femoral artery or clipped an organ, he would already be dead. It was lodged in the muscle. She needed to get it out and close the wound before infection set in. Maeve stood, her hands slick and shaking. She flicked on the kitchen light, ignoring the gruesome state of her floor. She boiled water on her cheap electric stove. She sterilized her only pair of forceps and a paring knife. She drew up a syringe of lidocaine. Returning to his side, she injected the local anesthetic in a tight circle around the gunshot wound. He didn't even twitch. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, grabbing the forceps. She dug in. The sickening squelch of metal slipping into torn flesh made her stomach roll. She had assisted on dozens of gunshot surgeries, but always with bright lights, a sterile field, and an attending physician barking orders. Here, on a cracked linoleum floor, smelling of old grease and fresh copper, it was just her and a dying stranger. Metal scraped metal. She found it. With a sharp pull, she extracted a deformed chunk of lead and dropped it into a coffee mug with a loud clink. She flooded the wound with iodine, packed it tightly with sterile gauze, and stapled the flesh closed with harsh, deliberate clicks. When she finally sat back, her scrubs were ruined. The man was still breathing. His pulse was weak, but steady. Maeve dragged herself to the sink, washed the blood off her hands with dish soap, and grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the drying rack. She pulled one of her dining chairs into the kitchenette, set it down 3 feet from him, and sat. She placed the skillet in her lap. Now, she just had to wait for him to wake up. Dawn broke over the city, casting a grey, bruised light through the dusty blinds. Maeve hadn't slept. She sat perfectly still in the wooden chair, her fingers cramped around the handle of the iron skillet, her eyes burning with fatigue. She had spent the last 6 hours watching the rise and fall of the stranger's chest, analyzing the rhythm of his breathing. Around 6 a.m., the rhythm changed. The shallow, even breaths hitched. A low hiss escaped his lips. His heavy dark lashes fluttered, fighting against the bright glare of the overhead kitchen light Maeve had left burning. She tightened her grip on the skillet. He didn't jolt awake like they do in the movies. He opened his eyes slowly. They were a piercing, cold blue, like ice trapped under glass. He didn't look at the ceiling in confusion. He didn't look at his wound. His eyes immediately darted around the small, cramped kitchen, calculating exits, assessing threats, before finally locking onto Maeve. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He shifted his weight, wincing slightly as the staples in his side pulled. His hand instinctively drifted toward the floor where his gun had been. "It's on top of the fridge," Maeve said. Her voice was hoarse, entirely devoid of the tremble she felt in her chest. He paused. His blue eyes dragged over her blood-stained scrubs, the trauma shears on the counter, the bloody dish towels, and finally, the heavy pan resting in her lap. He looked down at his ruined shirt and the neat, professional dressing covering his hip. A predator, Maeve realized. Even half dead, bleeding out on a linoleum floor, the man radiated a terrifying, coiled violence. He didn't look frightened or grateful. He looked like a wolf assessing a trap. He braced his hands against the floor and slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, leaning his broad shoulders against the lower cabinets. He breathed through his nose, a sharp intake of air that betrayed the agony he was in. "You dug it out," he stated. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It didn't sound like a question. "Yes," Maeve said. "It missed the bowel and the artery. You got lucky." "Lucky," he echoed softly, a humorless smirk touching the corner of his mouth. He looked around the room again. The peeling wallpaper, the leaky faucet dripping into the stainless steel sink, the stack of unpaid bills on the small table. "Who are you?" he asked. "I live here," Maeve said flatly. "You broke my door. You're a doctor, a nurse, ER." He studied her face. He was looking for something, a tell, a flinch, a lie. Maeve stared back, refusing to look away, wrapping her exhaustion around herself like armor. She had stitched up gang bangers and drug runners before. They were all the same when they were bleeding. But this man felt different. There was no chaotic panic in him, only a chilling, mechanical calm. "Why didn't you call the cops?" he asked, tilting his head. "Because if I call the cops, they ask questions. I don't have money for a lawyer, I don't have time for a precinct, and I don't want the people who shot you coming back to finish the job while I'm sleeping," she said. "I figured that saving your life and sending you on your way was the fastest way to get my kitchen back." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket. Maeve tensed, lifting the skillet an inch. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a sleek, black burner phone. He tapped a single button, held it to his ear, and waited. "It's me," he said into the phone. "I'm alive. The drop was compromised. They were waiting in the alley. 2 dead. I took a round in the oblique." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No, I'm secure. Give me an hour. Send a car to..." He looked at Maeve. "What's the address here?" Maeve gave him the address. Her voice sounded thin in the quiet room. He repeated the address into the phone and hung up. He tossed the phone onto the counter and looked back at her. The silence returned, heavier this time. He wasn't leaving immediately. His people were coming here. "You shouldn't have done that," Maeve said, a sudden spike of anger cutting through her fear. "I don't want your people here. I saved your life. Just leave." He didn't move. He just watched her. "You saved my life," he repeated, rolling the words around as if tasting at them. "You walked into your apartment, found an armed, bleeding man, and instead of running screaming into the street, you locked the door and performed a localized extraction with stolen hospital supplies. I did what I had to do." "You did it well," he noted, glancing at his side. "Very clean." "Thanks," she snapped. "Now get out." He ignored her demand. He leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes narrowing, shedding the last remnants of his post-surgical fog. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I've owned this building for 3 years through a shell corporation," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "This entire block is a designated dead zone for my organization. None of my enemies know I own it. None of my men know I own it." Maeve froze. Her lungs stopped working. The skillet in her lap suddenly felt incredibly useless. He tilted his head, his gaze boring into her skull, peeling back her layers. "So," he whispered, the question hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. "Who exactly gave you the key to my safe house, and how much did they pay you to wait here for me?" The absurdity of the question hung in the stale kitchen air, fighting the smell of dried blood and cheap dish soap. Maeve stared at the man sitting on her floor. Her brain misfired. She had expected threats. She had expected him to draw a weapon, or maybe toss a stack of blood-stained bills on the table and vanish into the rain. She had not expected to be accused of being a squatter in a mob safe house. A safe house, Maeve repeated. The words felt thick and heavy on her tongue. You think my apartment is your safe house? I know it is, he said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was the flat, dead tone of a man who dealt in facts and violence. I bought this building under a dummy LLC 3 years ago. The lower floors are supposed to be empty. This floor is my contingency. Nobody lives here. So I will ask you one last time before my people arrive, and the questions stop being polite. Who sent you? Maeve felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in the back of her throat. She swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She tightened her grip on the cast-iron skillet, the metal biting into her calloused palms. Nobody sent me, she said, her voice shaking with sudden hot rage. I didn't break in here to wait for you. I live here. I have lived here for 8 months. The shower drains slow, the radiator clanks like a dying engine at 2 in the morning, and the roaches have more square footage than I do. He didn't blink. His icy blue eyes tracked every micro-expression on her face. A civilian. A renter, she snapped. She stood up. The man immediately tensed, his hand twitching toward his empty hip. But Maeve didn't swing the skillet. She set it down on the counter with a loud clang. She turned her back on him, a profoundly stupid move, but anger was rapidly overriding her self-preservation instincts. She marched across the small kitchenette to the cheap laminate drawer beside the refrigerator. She yanked it open. It was a graveyard of take-out menus, loose batteries, and unpaid utility bills. She dug through the mess until her fingers found the folded manila envelope. Maeve turned back and tossed the envelope onto the floor beside him. It landed on a smear of his dried blood. "Look at it," she demanded. He didn't reach for it. He kept his eyes fixed on her. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his weight, suppressing a wince as the staples in his side pulled at his flesh. He picked up the envelope with 2 fingers, flipped it open, and pulled out the crumpled pages inside. "It's a lease," Maeve said, crossing her arms over her chest to hide the trembling in her hands. "Signed 8 months ago. I pay $1,200 a month in cash to a guy named Sal who drives a beat-up Buick and smells like stale cigars. He collects on the 1st of the month. If I'm a day late, he threatens to change the locks. If this is your building, then your property manager is double-dipping and running a slumlord side hustle." The man read the paperwork. His eyes scanned the cheap print, settling on the signature at the bottom. The silence in the room shifted. The predatory tension didn't vanish, but it morphed into something else. Calculation. "Maeve Gallagher," he read aloud. Hearing her name in that low, gravelly voice sent a shiver down her spine. "That's me." He dropped the papers back onto the floor. He leaned his head against the cabinet, closing his eyes for a brief second. The adrenaline of waking up was fading, and the reality of massive blood loss was catching up to him. His skin was dangerously pale, a fine sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Sal," the man murmured. A dark, humorless smile touched his lips. "Sal is going to have a very bad day." "I don't care what you do to Sal," Maeve said. She stepped closer, dropping her voice. "Your hour is almost up. Your people are coming. You know I'm not a threat to you. So you get up, you walk out that door, and we pretend this never happened." He opened his eyes. The ice in them had thawed slightly, replaced by a grim, pragmatic exhaustion. "It doesn't work like that." "I saved your life, and that complicates things," he replied smoothly. "If you were a spy, I would shoot you. If you were an assassin, I would torture you. But you are a civilian who has seen my face, learned about my safe house, and stitched me up like a piece of torn upholstery. That makes you a liability." I'm a nurse who wants to go to sleep. Maeve's voice cracked. The reality of the situation was finally piercing her armor. I don't know who you are. I don't care. I just want you out of my kitchen. My name is Gideon, he said. He didn't offer a last name. He didn't need to. And unfortunately for you, Maeve Gallagher, walking away isn't an option. Before she could argue, a sound cut through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Tires squealing on wet asphalt. Maeve turned toward the window. 3 heavy black SUVs had just aggressively jumped the curb, blocking the street in front of her building. The doors opened in unison. Men poured out into the early morning rain. They didn't look like cops. They didn't move like paramedics. They moved with a synchronized, brutal efficiency, wearing dark coats and carrying things that caught the dull grey light. "They're here," Gideon said. He didn't sound relieved. He sounded like a man preparing for a second war. Maeve backed away from the window. Her heart hammered against her ribs, frantic and useless. She looked at the blood on the floor, the surgical tools on the counter, the man bleeding against her cabinets. The life she knew, the crushing shifts, the unpaid bills, the quiet desperation, was gone. Heavy, rapid footsteps echoed in the stairwell. They were coming up. The footsteps didn't pause at the second floor or the third. They bypassed the rest of the building with absolute certainty, thudding against the cheap wood of the stairs with military precision. Maeve stood paralyzed in the center of her kitchen. She looked at the door, the one with the broken deadbolt hanging uselessly from the frame. Gideon didn't tell her to hide. Hiding was pointless. The door was kicked open the rest of the way. It slammed against the drywall with a violent crack, leaving a dent in the plaster. 3 men filled the entryway. They were large, broad-shouldered, and soaked from the rain. Their suits were dark and tailored, completely out of place in her rotting hallway. But it was the weapons that held Maeve's attention. The man in the front, a tall, severe-looking guy with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, had a suppressed submachine gun raised and ready. He swept the room in a fraction of a second. The gun pointed at Maeve's chest. "Clear!" the man shouted, his voice a harsh bark. "Lower it, Dominic," Gideon commanded from the floor. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a dense, gravitational weight. It was the voice of a man who had never once been ignored. The man in the doorway, Dominic, snapped his gaze downward, spotting Gideon slumped against the kitchen cabinets. Dominic's eyes widened. He instantly lowered the weapon, dropping to one knee beside his boss. The other 2 men fanned out, one securing the window, the other standing guard at the broken door. They completely ignored Maeve, treating her like a piece of broken furniture. "Boss," Dominic said, his hands hovering over Gideon, unsure where to touch him. He saw the blood soaking the floor, the ruined shirt, the stark white gauze taped over Gideon's side. "Christ, they said you took a round. The extraction team got delayed by a roadblock. We thought we were walking into a morgue." "You almost did," Gideon said, his breathing shallow. "Who ran the ambush?" It looked like the Albanians. Unmarked vans, heavy Russian surplus gear. They knew the route, Gideon. They knew exactly where the car was going to be. "A leak," Gideon muttered. His jaw clenched. "Clean this up. We need to move." "Now," Dominic nodded, pulling a radio from his belt. "Bring the kit up. He's stable, but he can't walk." He pocketed the radio and finally turned his head to look at Maeve. His dark eyes were suspicious, sweeping over her blood-soaked scrubs and the surgical tools scattered on the counter. "Who is the girl?" Dominic asked, his tone flat. "She lives here," Gideon said. Dominic's brow furrowed. "Nobody lives here. This is a blind property. Apparently Sal decided to collect rent on our blind properties," Gideon said. The sheer menace in his tone made Dominic flinch. "She found me bleeding out. She's a trauma nurse." Dominic looked at the neat row of staples holding Gideon's flesh together, then back at Maeve. The suspicion in his eyes didn't fade. It hardened into a cold, lethal calculus. She saw your face. She knows the location. She heard the comms. Dominic didn't raise his gun, but his hand drifted toward the pistol, holstered inside his jacket. Maeve stopped breathing. She knew exactly what that look meant. In their world, you didn't leave loose ends in a compromised safe house. You tied them off. "Don't," Gideon said. The single word cracked like a whip. Dominic froze. "She stitched me up," Gideon continued, his voice straining with effort as he braced himself against the cabinet. "She kept me breathing. You don't put a bullet in the woman who just dug one out of me." "Boss with respect," Dominic argued, keeping his voice low. "We are compromised. We have a leak in the inner circle. We can't leave a witness behind for the police, or worse, the Albanians, to find." "I didn't say we were leaving her," Gideon replied. Maeve's stomach dropped out. She finally found her voice, though it sounded reedy and desperate. No, I am not going anywhere with you. You said I wasn't a threat. I showed you the lease. I saved your life. You owe me." Gideon looked at her. The exhaustion in his face was momentarily eclipsed by a terrifying, absolute authority. "I am repaying you, Maeve. If I leave you here, the men who shot me will eventually find this apartment. When they do, they will peel your skin off to find out what you told me." Gideon reached out, grabbing Dominic's shoulder to pull himself up. Dominic immediately hooked an arm under his boss, hauling him to his feet. Gideon groaned, a sharp, guttural sound of agony, but he didn't collapse. He leaned heavily on his second-in-command, fixing his icy gaze on Maeve. "You're dead if you stay here," Gideon said. "Grab your coat." "I have a shift at the hospital tomorrow," Maeve protested. A ridiculous, mundane defense against an impossible situation. She backed away until her spine hit the refrigerator door. "I can't just leave. My life is here." "Your life ended the second I bled on your floor," Gideon said. He didn't say it with malice. He said it like a medical diagnosis. Incurable, terminal. 2 more men rushed into the apartment, carrying a canvas stretcher. They moved with terrifying speed, unfolding it in the narrow hallway. "Bag her," Dominic ordered one of the men at the door. The man stepped forward. He didn't pull a weapon. He just reached out with massive, unyielding hands. Maeve tried to shove him away, her fists connecting with a chest that felt like a brick wall. He didn't even flinch. He grabbed her by the upper arms, his grip bruising and absolute, dragging her toward the broken door. "Let me go!" Maeve shouted, digging her heels into the linoleum. "You can't do this!" Gideon was lowered onto the stretcher. As they lifted him, he turned his head, his pale face contrasting sharply with the dark blood on his collar. He looked at her struggling against his men. "Don't hurt her," Gideon told the man holding her. "But don't let her go." They carried him out into the stairwell. Maeve was dragged right behind him, her boots scraping across the floorboards. She looked back one last time at her cramped, pathetic kitchen. The bloody dish towels, the coffee mug holding a deformed bullet, the cheap iron skillet on the counter. It wasn't much of a home. But as they hauled her down the dark, buzzing stairwell toward the waiting SUVs, she knew she was never going to see it again. The stairwell smelled of wet dog and ammonia. The man dragging Maeve didn't stumble once, his grip on her biceps, iron-clad and bruising. She stopped kicking by the second floor. It was a waste of oxygen, and her boots were only scuffing the cheap wood anyway. They hit the lobby doors, bursting out into the freezing morning rain. The street was utterly deserted. In this neighborhood, when black SUVs rolled up and men with guns stepped out, people locked their doors and pretended they were deaf. Maeve was shoved toward the middle vehicle. The heavy armored door was yanked open, and she was tossed inside with the casual roughness of luggage being loaded into a cargo hold. She landed hard on the leather seats, scrambling backward until her shoulders hit the opposite door. The locks engaged with a heavy, final thunk. A second later, the opposite door opened. Gideon was maneuvered inside, groaning as his men carefully arranged him across the wide bench seat. He was pale, his skin taking on the waxy, translucent sheen of a man running out of blood. Dominic slid into the front passenger seat, slamming his door. "Go!" Dominic barked. The convoy accelerated violently. Maeve was thrown against the door panel as the heavy SUV tore away from the curb, leaving her entire life behind in the rearview mirror. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. The glass was thick, muting the wail of the sirens somewhere in the distance and the harsh drumming of the rain. The interior smelled of expensive leather, wet wool, and the sharp, metallic odor of fresh blood. Gideon's head rested against the window, his eyes closed. The ride was smooth, but every time the SUV took a corner, his jaw tightened. The white gauze taped to his side was no longer white. A dark, ugly stain was blooming through the center, spreading fast. Maeve watched it. She tried to look away. She tried to focus on the blur of the city outside the tinted windows, telling herself to let him bleed. He had kidnapped her. He was a criminal. He was the reason her door was broken and her life was ruined. But she was a nurse. 10 years in trauma wards had hardwired her brain. She couldn't watch a man bleed out without doing something about it. It was a compulsion. "He's hemorrhaging," Maeve said. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet cabin. Dominic glanced back through the partition grill. His dark eyes flicked from Maeve to the spreading stain on Gideon's shirt. "We're 20 minutes out," Dominic said to the driver, his voice tight. He looked at Maeve. "Fix it." "I don't have my tools," she snapped back. "You dragged me out of my kitchen, remember? I need gauze. I need pressure." Dominic reached under his seat and tossed a black tactical trauma kit through the gap in the partition. It hit the floorboards at Maeve's feet. She didn't hesitate. She unzipped the kit, pulling out a thick roll of combat gauze and a pair of latex gloves. She snapped the gloves on, the sharp smack of the rubber echoing in the car. She slid off her seat, dropping to her knees on the floorboards between the 2 rows. "Hey," she said, tapping Gideon's shoulder. "Hey, open your eyes. You're bleeding through the staples." Gideon's eyelids fluttered. The icy blue was clouded with pain. He looked down at her hands, then at his side. The movement tore them, Maeve muttered, mostly to herself. She didn't ask for permission. She grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt and ripped it further open to expose the wound. The staples were still holding, but the jagged edges of the torn muscle beneath had shifted, reopening the damaged vessels. She folded a thick wad of gauze. "This is going to hurt." "Do it," Gideon rasped. Maeve pressed the gauze directly over the staples and leaned into it with her body weight. Gideon didn't scream, but a harsh, animalistic hiss tore through his teeth. His hand shot out, his large fingers clamping around Maeve's wrist like a vice. His grip was terrifyingly strong for a dying man. He was crushing her bones. "Let go," she said calmly, keeping steady pressure on his side. "You're cutting off my circulation, and I need both hands to stop you from bleeding out on this very expensive floor mat." He stared at her. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Slowly his fingers uncurled. He dropped his hand back to his side, his chest heaving. "You don't panic," Gideon observed, his voice barely a whisper over the hum of the engine. "I panic plenty," Maeve said, not looking at his face, keeping her eyes on her bloody hands. "Just not about blood. Blood is a mechanical failure. I know how to fix a mechanical failure. It's the men with submachine guns kicking my door in that I don't know how to handle. Dominic is protective." Dominic is a thug in a nice suit." A weak, breathy sound escaped Gideon's throat. It took Maeve a second to realize it was a laugh. It ended in a wet cough. "Don't talk," she ordered. "Your blood pressure is bottoming out. Just breathe." For the next 15 minutes, Maeve knelt on the floor of the moving SUV, her hands pressed hard into the side of a Mafia boss. The city blocks gave way to the industrial outskirts, the scenery shifting from towering apartment buildings to desolate warehouses and shipping yards. Gideon didn't speak again. He just watched her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the absolute lack of hesitation in her bloody hands. He had expected her to cry. He had expected her to beg. Instead, she was just doing her job. The SUV took a sharp, descending turn, diving into a concrete tunnel. The darkness swallowed them whole. The convoy slammed to a halt inside a sprawling underground parking garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glare over a dozen high-end vehicles parked in neat rows. Before the SUV even settled on its shocks, the doors were thrown open. Maeve stepped back, pulling her bloody hands away from Gideon's side. A medical team was already waiting. They weren't wearing hospital scrubs. They wore dark jeans and black shirts, but they moved with clinical precision, rolling a titanium stretcher right to the door. A tall, older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses pushed past Dominic. He carried a leather medical bag that looked 50 years old. "Let me see him," the older man demanded. "He took one in the oblique, Alden," Dominic said, stepping aside. The girl dug the round out and stapled him. He tore it open in transit. Dr. Alden Hayes peered into the SUV. He barely glanced at Maeve, his focus entirely on Gideon. He peeled back the bloody gauze she had been holding. He inspected the staples, the swelling, and the iodine staining the skin. "Rough work," Alden murmured, his voice a dry, professorial rasp. "But the placement is accurate. She missed the artery by a centimeter. Whoever did this kept you alive, Gideon." "Get him on the table," Dominic snapped. They hauled Gideon out of the car. He was barely conscious now, the adrenaline crash finally taking him under. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, his head rolled toward Maeve. "Alden," Gideon slurred, his voice weak but threaded with iron. "Don't speak, save your strength," the doctor said, already prepping an IV bag. "The nurse," Gideon forced the words out, locking eyes with his doctor. "She stays. Put her in the east wing, lock the door. Do not let Dominic near her." Dominic flinched. The insult hit him physically. "Boss, she's a risk." "Do it," Gideon commanded, his eyes rolling back before he completely lost consciousness. Alden nodded sharply. "Move him, let's go." The medical team sprinted toward a set of heavy steel double doors at the far end of the garage. Dominic watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. The remaining armed men fanned out, securing the perimeter of the concrete cavern. Maeve stood alone by the open door of the SUV, wiping her bloody hands on her ruined scrubs. She was freezing. The damp chill of the garage was seeping into her bones. She looked at the exit ramp. It was a steep incline, blocked by a massive steel roll-down gate. There was no way out. Dominic turned back to her. His eyes were cold, devoid of the panic he had shown upstairs in her apartment. Now, he was just a man looking at a problem. "You heard him," Dominic said to a broad-shouldered guard standing nearby. "East wing, room 4. Lock her in." The guard, a young guy with a broken nose and a neck thicker than Maeve's waist, nodded. "Let's go, sweetheart." Maeve didn't fight. The fight had drained out of her the moment they dragged Gideon away. She let the guard lead her toward a private elevator, tucked into an alcove. They rode up in silence. The elevator didn't ding when the doors slid open. It just revealed a long, softly lit hallway lined with thick, sound-dampening carpet and dark wood paneling. It looked like the top floor of a 5-star hotel, entirely disconnected from the brutalist concrete bunker below. The guard stopped at the 4th door on the right. He scanned a keycard, pushed the heavy oak door open, and stepped aside. "Inside," he said. Maeve walked in. The room was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows covered the far wall, though they were made of thick, tinted glass that distorted the grey sky outside. There was a king-sized bed with immaculate white linens, a sitting area with a velvet couch, and a sprawling ensuite bathroom visible through an open door. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. "If you need food, use the phone by the bed. Dial 0, the guard said, lingering in the doorway. "Don't try the windows. They're ballistic glass. Don't try the door. The deadbolt is magnetic and controlled from the security desk." "How long am I going to be here?" Maeve asked. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by exhaustion. The guard offered a grim, unsympathetic smile. "That depends on if the boss wakes up. If he lives, he decides what happens to you. If he dies..." The guard shrugged. "Dominic decides." He pulled the door shut. The magnetic lock engaged with a heavy, terrifying click. Maeve stood in the center of the luxurious room. She looked down at her hands, stained brown with dried blood. She looked at her cheap, worn-out boots sinking into the expensive carpet. She walked into the bathroom. The counters were marble. The shower was a massive glass enclosure. She turned on the faucet, watching the steaming water rush over her hands, turning pink as it washed Gideon's blood down the drain. She stared at her reflection in the vanity mirror. She looked like a ghost, pale, hollow-eyed, and covered in someone else's war. She had saved a man's life because it was her job. She hadn't realized that keeping his heart beating meant surrendering her own freedom. Gideon wasn't going to let her go. Men who lived behind ballistic glass and steel gates didn't believe in loose ends. They believed in property. And now she belonged to him. Time lost its shape in the gilded cage. There were no clocks on the walls, and the heavy tinted glass of the ballistic windows made it impossible to tell the exact time of day. Maeve only knew that the sky shifted from slate grey to an impenetrable, bruised black, and back again. She slept. It was all she could do for the first 24 hours. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow, leaving her limbs feeling like lead and her brain foggy with exhaustion. She stripped off her blood-stiffened scrubs, took a scalding shower until her skin turned pink, and crawled under the heavy, immaculate duvet of the king-sized bed. She dreamed of sirens, metallic clicks, and the smell of copper. When she finally woke, the hunger was a sharp ache in her stomach. She used the bedside phone. She dialed 0. A polite, anonymous male voice answered on the first ring, took her order for eggs and black coffee, and hung up. 20 minutes later, the magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy thud. The door opened just wide enough for the young guard with the broken nose to slide a silver tray onto a small console table. He didn't look at her. He stepped out, and the door locked again. The food was restaurant quality. Maeve ate it, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the locked door. 2 more days passed exactly like this. She paced the length of the room until her calves ached. She catalogued every item in the space, looking for anything that could be used as a tool or a weapon. There was nothing. The television was bolted to the wall and disconnected from any network. The bathroom mirror was shatterproof acrylic, not glass. The hangers in the closet were thick, blunt wood, permanently attached to the rod. It was a beautiful room, meticulously designed to be completely harmless. They were keeping her alive, but they were keeping her contained. That meant Gideon was still breathing. If he had died on the table, Dominic would have walked through that door on day 1. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the routine broke. The heavy lock clicked, but no silver tray appeared. The door swung wide. Dominic stood in the hallway. He wore a fresh suit, perfectly tailored, but his face was drawn, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of a man who hadn't slept since the ambush. "Get up," Dominic said. Maeve was sitting on the velvet couch, staring at the grey sky. She didn't move immediately. She let the silence stretch for 3 beats, holding his hostile stare. Then she stood, smoothing her hands over the oversized cotton t-shirt and sweatpants she had found folded in the dresser. "Where are we going?" she asked. "He wants to see you." Dominic didn't wait for a response. He turned and started walking down the plush hallway. Maeve followed, keeping a careful distance. The compound was massive. They took a different elevator down, descending deep into the bones of the building. The doors opened to a sterile, brightly lit corridor that smelled sharply of bleach and rubbing alcohol. It looked exactly like the VIP wing of a private hospital, complete with crash carts and reinforced doors. 2 men carrying sidearms stood outside the last room on the left. They stepped aside as Dominic approached. He opened the door and gestured for her to go inside. Maeve crossed the threshold. The room was vast and filled with the low, rhythmic hum of medical equipment. Dr. Alden Hayes sat in a leather armchair in the corner, reading a thick medical journal. He barely glanced up. In the center of the room, on a highly modified hospital bed, lay Gideon. He looked significantly worse than he had in the back of the SUV, yet somehow more dangerous. He was shirtless, his chest wrapped in thick white bandages. An IV line snaked into the back of his left hand, pumping clear fluids and heavy painkillers into his veins. His face was pale, the hollows of his cheeks pronounced, but his eyes were wide open. The freezing blue gaze snapped to Maeve the second she entered. He pressed a button on the side rail. The head of the bed hummed, raising him into a sitting position. He didn't wince, though the tight clench of his jaw betrayed the effort. "Dominic," Gideon said. His voice was a rasping, dry whisper, but the authority was absolute. "Wait outside." Dominic hesitated, his eyes darting to Maeve. "Boss, she's outside." Dominic's jaw tightened. He shot Maeve a look of pure venom, turned on his heel, and left, shutting the heavy door firmly behind him. The silence in the room was dense. The heart monitor beeped a steady, slow rhythm. "You look better," Maeve lied flatly. She stood near the foot of the bed, refusing to shrink under his intense scrutiny. "You look rested," Gideon countered. He reached with his right hand, picking up a glass of water from the bedside table. He took a slow sip. "I'm told I owe you a second thank you. Alden says the pressure you applied in the vehicle kept my blood volume just high enough to prevent cardiac arrest." "It's basic trauma care," Maeve said. "Stop the leak. Keep the machine running." "You view the human body as a machine." "When it's broken, yes." Gideon set the glass down. He studied her, dissecting her posture, her tone, the defensive crossing of her arms. "I've been unconscious for 3 days. My organization has been attempting to locate the source of the leak that led to the ambush. It is a messy, violent process." "I don't care about your organization," Maeve interrupted, her voice gaining a hard edge. "I care about when I get to leave. You survived. Your doctor is here. You don't need me anymore. I want my life back." Gideon didn't blink. He just stared at her. The steady beep of the heart monitor didn't accelerate. "You don't have a life to go back to, Maeve," he said quietly. The absolute certainty in his voice made the blood drain from her face. She gripped the plastic footboard of the hospital bed, her knuckles turning white. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Gideon replied, his tone remaining terrifyingly calm. "I am merely the messenger." He reached beside his pillow and pulled out a sleek tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, then slid it across the mattress toward her. "Look at it," he commanded. Maeve hesitated. Her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. Slowly, she reached out and picked up the tablet. The screen displayed a high-resolution photograph taken at night. At first, Maeve couldn't process what she was looking at. It was a building, its brick facade blackened and scarred by intense heat. Yellow police tape cordoned off the sidewalk. Fire engines with flashing lights blocked the narrow street. Then she saw the bodega sign on the corner. It was her building. She swiped to the next photo. It was an interior shot of an apartment, entirely gutted by fire. The walls were stripped to the studs. A melted refrigerator sat in a puddle of ash and ruined linoleum. In the center of the kitchen, completely blackened but recognizable by its shape, was the cast-iron skillet she had been holding when Gideon woke up. "The Albanians hit the building 12 hours after we left." Gideon's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. "They realized I survived the ambush. They tracked the blood trail to your door. When they didn't find me, they tossed the place, shot your landlord Sal in the chest, and torched the entire floor with gasoline to destroy any forensic evidence we might have left behind." Maeve stared at the screen. Her breathing grew shallow. "If I had let you stay," Gideon continued, merciless and precise, "you would have been in that apartment. They would not have shot you quickly like they shot Sal. They would have taken you to a warehouse, broken every bone in your hands, and peeled you apart to find out where I went." Maeve dropped the tablet onto the bed. It clattered against the plastic rail. She stepped back. The sterile walls of the medical suite seemed to close in on her. Her chest heaved. 8 months of 12-hour shifts, the rent money stuffed in envelopes, the cheap coats, the exhaustion, all of it, gone. Burned to ash because a bleeding man broke her door frame. She didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, a cold, furious clarity washed over her. "You brought them to my door," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Yes," Gideon admitted without a shred of hesitation. "You destroyed my life." "I ended your old one," he corrected, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "And I saved your life by pulling you out of that building. We are even." "Even?" Maeve laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that made Dr. Alden briefly look up from his journal. "I have nothing. I don't have clothes. I don't have a job. I don't even have a toothbrush. I am a hostage. You were a hostage for the last 3 days because I was unconscious, and Dominic does not take risks with my safety," Gideon said, shifting his weight against the pillows. He grunted slightly, but quickly masked the pain. "You are no longer a hostage, Maeve. I have a proposition for you." Maeve crossed her arms, digging her fingernails into her biceps to keep her hands from trembling. "I don't patch up murderers. You've patched up gang members in your ER for a decade," Gideon countered smoothly, showing he had clearly had her background thoroughly vetted while he was bleeding out on a table. "You treat the wound, not the morality of the patient. I am offering you an exclusive contract." "A what?" "A job." Gideon pointed to the IV in his arm, then gestured vaguely to the walls around them. "My organization has a leak, a severe one. High-level intelligence was fed to my enemies. Until I find the rat and kill him, I cannot trust anyone in my inner circle. I cannot trust the guards outside this door. I cannot trust my own private medical staff, save for Alden." Dr. Alden turned a page of his journal, completely unbothered by the conversation. "Alden is an excellent diagnostician, but he is 72 with arthritis," Gideon continued. "He cannot handle the physical demands of trauma recovery. I need a nurse, someone who knows how to keep quiet, who doesn't panic when the blood starts flowing, and most importantly, someone who has absolutely zero ties to my organization. I need someone I know for a fact is not working for the men trying to kill me. You want me to be your private nurse, Maeve summarized, the absurdity of the situation tasting like metal in her mouth. I want you to keep me alive while I hunt down the people who burned down your apartment, Gideon said. In exchange, you will be paid 5 times your hospital salary. In cash, you will live here, in this compound where you are safe. When the threat is neutralized and my house is in order, you are free to leave with enough money to buy your own building. No more slum lords. No more double shifts. Maeve stared at him. The man was a monster. He was a creature of violence and absolute control. But as she looked into his freezing blue eyes, she realized he wasn't lying. He didn't need to lie. He held all the cards. And if I say no? She asked quietly. If I tell you, I want to walk out that door right now? Gideon didn't threaten her. He simply laid out the math. You walk out that door with the clothes on your back. The Albanians have my face, but they also have yours now. My men confirmed they pulled the security footage from the bodega across your street before the fire. You will be hunted. I give you 48 hours before they find you, and I will not send Dominic to pull you out a second time. It wasn't a choice. It was a cage with a salary. Maeve looked at the tablet resting on the bed. She looked at the picture of the burned-out window where she used to drink cheap coffee and watch the rain. Her old life was dead. The man lying in front of her had killed it. She looked back up at Gideon. Her fear was gone, replaced by a cynical, hardening armor. 10 times my salary, Maeve said, her voice dropping into a cold, flat register that mirrored his own. Paid into an offshore account that your men can't touch. I get my own medical supplies. I dictate my own hours when you aren't bleeding out, and Dominic doesn't speak to me. Ever. A slow, genuine smirk touched the corner of Gideon's mouth. It changed his face entirely, making him look less like a corpse and more like the predator she had met in her kitchen. Deal, Gideon said. The transition from emergency room nurse to private mob physician took exactly 3 days. Maeve didn't ease into the role. She attacked it with the same clinical, detached aggression she used to survive 16-hour double shifts at St. Jude's. She commandeered a guest room down the hall from Gideon's suite and handed a bewildered guard a handwritten list of demands. Within 48 hours, she had a surgical steel examination table, an industrial autoclave, and a locked pharmacy cabinet stocked with enough narcotics to sedate a small army. She owned the East Wing. The armed men quickly learned to stay out of her way. Gideon, however, was a nightmare of a patient. He was a man constructed entirely of control and leverage. Being confined to a bed, reliant on IV bags and a woman he barely knew, gnawed at his sanity. By the 10th day, he was out of bed, walking the halls with a heavy cane, his face tight with suppressed agony. Maeve let him push himself exactly to the edge of his physical limits, and not a millimeter further. The collision between her authority and his was inevitable. It happened on a Tuesday, during a torrential downpour that pounded against the ballistic glass. Gideon had converted the grand dining room into a war room. He had been locked inside for 4 hours with Dominic and 3 lieutenants, hunting the rat who had sold him out. When the clock in her makeshift clinic hit hour 5, Maeve stood up, grabbed her medical kit, and walked down the hall. 2 heavily armed guards crossed their arms as she approached the double doors. "Boss is in a closed session," the taller one grunted. "Boss is due for 60 milligrams of Toradol and a dressing change," Maeve stated, not slowing her pace. "Move." She pushed past them and shoved the heavy oak doors open. The room went dead silent. 5 dangerous men turned to look at her. Blueprints and shipping manifests covered the mahogany table. In the center, leaning heavily over the documents with both hands braced on the wood, stood Gideon. He was wearing a black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked up, his icy blue eyes narrowing. Dominic instantly stepped forward, slipping a hand inside his jacket. "You don't walk in here, Gallagher." Maeve ignored him completely. She walked straight to Gideon. Her eyes tracked the tremor in his left arm and the unnatural tilt of his posture. He was favoring his right side heavily. "Sit down," Maeve ordered. One of the lieutenants let out a disbelieving scoff. Dominic flushed with anger. "I told you to get out." "Dominic," Gideon said quietly. The single word froze his second-in-command. Gideon shifted his gaze back to Maeve. The predatory intensity in his eyes was suffocating. He was testing her, waiting to see if she would flinch under the weight of an audience. She didn't. She set her kit on the table, right on top of a harbor map. "You're sweating through your shirt. Your heart rate is elevated. And you've been standing for 5 hours on a torn oblique muscle," Maeve said, her voice dropping into the unyielding tone of an ER veteran dealing with a drunk driver. "If you pop those staples again, I am not digging around in your abdomen to fix it. Sit down, or I will sedate you where you stand." Silence stretched tight across the room. The men waited for Gideon to signal them to drag her out. Instead, a muscle feathered in Gideon's jaw. Slowly, he released his grip on the table and lowered himself into the heavy leather chair, suppressing a sharp hiss of breath. "Meeting adjourned," Gideon told his men, his eyes never leaving Maeve. "Get out!" Dominic looked like he had swallowed glass, but he nodded sharply. The men filed out. The heavy doors clicked shut. Maeve snapped blue latex gloves onto her hands. She unbuttoned the lower half of Gideon's shirt, peeling the dark fabric back to expose the white bandage. The edges were stained bright red. "You're bleeding," she muttered, grabbing trauma shears to cut away the ruined tape. "It's a minor tear," Gideon said, watching her hands work. "You enjoy doing that." "Doing what?" "Humiliating Dominic, establishing dominance in a room full of killers." Maeve paused, pressing a fresh square of sterile gauze against his skin. She met his freezing stare. "I don't care about Dominic's ego. I care about my 10 times salary, and I can't collect it if you bleed out. I am keeping my end of the bargain." "You are," Gideon agreed softly. He didn't flinch as she applied the surgical tape. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. The violent energy that usually rolled off him had receded into a heavy stillness. "Why didn't you run?" he asked suddenly. Maeve tossed the bloody gauze into a biohazard bag. "Run where?" "You burned my life to the ground." "Before," Gideon clarified. He lifted his right hand, lightly wrapping his large fingers around her gloved wrist. The contact sent a sudden, electric jolt up her arm. She froze. "When you found me in your kitchen, you could have let me die. Why didn't you?" Maeve looked at his hand, then his face. She wanted to give a cold, clinical answer. "Because a body on my floor meant dealing with the police," she lied, her voice lacking its usual bite. Gideon's thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, pressing exactly over her pulse point. He felt the rapid, hammering betrayal of her heartbeat against his skin. A slow, knowing smirk touched his lips. "Right," he whispered, letting go. Just a mechanical failure. Maeve stepped back, stripping off her gloves with a sharp snap. Her hands were shaking. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just his nurse, and he was no longer just her captor. The lines were blurring, and in this world, blurred lines were how you got killed. The undeniable spark between a ruthless Mafia boss and the cynical nurse keeping him alive is officially ignited. Maeve might be trapped in Gideon's world, but she's rapidly proving she won't be just another pawn in his deadly game. Will her strict clinical boundaries hold up against his intense scrutiny, or is she about to lose her heart to the man who ruined her life? Let me know your predictions in the comments below. If you're hooked on this dark romance, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for the next thrilling chapter of their story.